Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start the session now. Can everyone hear me okay? Welcome, everybody, to a very exciting session today, the SDG Pavilion, Grassroots Mobilisation for a Just Energy Transition. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the panelists I have today. But before that, I'll introduce myself quickly. So, for those who don't know me, my name is James Ladbrook. I'm a renewable energy consultant at KPMG Australia. I'm also a board director of UN Youth Australia, the treasurer of the World Economic Forum Global Shapers Sydney Hub, and co-founder of Pacific Mateship Cities, which is an organization that did an event at the Australia Pavilion last week with members of local and state and federal government, helping with the Pacific Australia Partnership, which we will hopefully hear from very, very soon, potentially in the next hour, about the outcome of COP31. So this is a very exciting event for many reasons. On my right, we have Fahad Haider. Fahad is a renewable energy engineer similar to me for Ekistika in the Northern Territory in Australia. He's also the founder of Emanate, which is a organization developing clean energy for communities, and is a IRENA ambassador. To his right, we have Kevin Chalub, who's the founder and CEO of EV Lab. We will go back to Kevin, but to his right, we have Angelos Pastras. Angelos is part of the Commonwealth Sustainable Energy Transition for Youth, which is an organization that tries to set up capacity building for just energy transition in different Commonwealth states, and is also a senior consultant at DNV. Now back to Kevin. Kevin, today you made a very exciting announcement with our panelist who unfortunately couldn't be here today, Juan Carlos. So Kevin, would you like to begin by telling us what you announced today and why you think it is relevant to our event today? Thank you.
Sure. Can you hear me? Does the mic work? Yeah, awesome. We just announced that we're going to be donating 220 households in Panama, where we have some operations there. We're going to be donating solar panels to indigenous communities and women over there who are basically have no access to electricity. So we're delighted to be able to do that, and just gonna say a small word about that really. But yeah, we're gonna be doing that, and also started EV Lab, the multi-brand electric store. It's based in Dubai. Happy to talk about that a bit more too.
Yes, please. Tell us.
Sure. We started an electric car multi-brand store. We lease electric cars from any brand, reducing emissions from electric cars in Dubai. And we're hoping to internationalize our concept soon.
Well, if that isn't literally grassroots mobilization, then right. I don't know what is. Fahad, you also were telling me earlier about helping communities with solar. I know Panama is on the other side of the world to the Northern Territory in Australia. Maybe for the audience that don't know much about the very north of Australia, you could maybe start by explaining it and then what the work that you've been doing.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. So I work full-time as a renewable energy engineer, as was mentioned. I'm based in Alice Springs, which is pretty much literally the middle of Australia. So the middle of Australia is very remote. It's like, we call it the desert, right? And then it's mostly off-grid systems, and there are numerous, we have the grid there too, but there are many remote communities that are off-grid. So a lot of our work is putting up, working with the government, working with the grid, working on off-grid systems to try to install these systems in indigenous communities and remote communities of remote Australia pretty much. And I also run my own organization called Emanate. The idea of that is, the tagline is pretty much empowering developing communities with clean energy. So we have done projects in Bangladesh, we've done projects in Papua New Guinea in terms of installing off-grid systems in remote schools, mosques, and so on. But we also hold capacity building sessions. We've held capacity building sessions with organizations in Uganda and Nigeria and other parts of the world as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Ahad. And I think before we go further into renewable energy and a just transition, I think let's take a step back and really try and understand why it's really important to have solar and battery storage in these remote communities. Because I think a lot of us talk about renewable energy as in it's really good for the environment, it's really good for climate change, it's really good for mitigation of fossil fuel emissions in the future. But what we're talking about today is actually more important than that, okay? The reason why indigenous and remote communities having solar is so important is because of their energy security. And with energy security, if you think about if the lights didn't turn on in your house and you couldn't run hot water and you couldn't use your appliances, that has severe health risks. And if you're in a remote community that's not near a hospital and is not near shops where you can buy something or somewhere you can go, this is very, very dangerous. And so when we're talking about mobilization in these grassroots communities, this is life and death, okay? Yes, it is really good to scale up solar, and if you guys didn't know, Australia has the most rooftop solar in the whole world. As a matter of fact, we have more rooftop solar than utility scale solar. And our utility scale solar farms have 1 million solar panels on them. Sorry, 1,000 solar panels on them. And we still have way more rooftop solar in Australia. So we're talking about a really, really important issue here about energy security and safety. And so when we talk about the Northern Territory of Australia, they have 3 disconnected microgrids. What does that mean? It means that in their communities, they run electricity systems that are not connected to each other like it is in the whole eastern coast of Australia. And I really want to hear more about the Panama context because I'm sure it's very similar. But what that means is if there's a blackout, and there's a lot of blackouts in the Northern Territory, there are those hours and days at a time with no electricity. And so if you can have that solar in your home or in your community or a community battery, that 24 hours extra or maybe 24 hours over a few days that you can have extra can literally save lives. So having a grant, is really, really important. Would you want to expand on that, Pod?
I'll just add something to that. So the project that I'm focusing more on, they are like completely off grid. So these are communities with a few hundred people that are not connected to the microgrids you mentioned as well. So there's perhaps a 100 kilowatt system, 200 kilowatt system that's separate, and then these connect. So currently there are a few communities in the Northern Territory that run on diesel. So again, we know the volatility that's happened with diesel and the price increase and so on. And what we are doing, we are working on a few projects where we are replacing the diesel generators with PV. So what that means is we are doing the feasibility study, for example, of how much solar like PV will go on site, how many kilowatts, and then how much battery based on the days of autonomy or how much extra days it can last without solar. And then we also have a backup gen. So again, these are very interesting, very I mean, the fact that you see the impact instantly, and then relating to mitigation as well. They're running on diesel, they're loud, they smell bad, and obviously it's a lot of emissions, and it's expensive. And we are genuinely seeing that with battery systems, it's a bit more, but we are genuinely seeing that the communities, the PV system makes up the money within 7 years, 8 years. And after that, it's a lot cheaper compared to diesel. So it's not just mitigation now, it's also financial stability as well as energy security in this situation. It's like 3 wins in a row. So it's very interesting, and I'm very proud to be part of this project. Thanks.
Do you want to speak to the Panama context in this example?
Sure. I mean, we're all doing a little bit the same thing. So I think it's really relevant to talk about solar in how decentralized mechanisms for solar can actually work. I mean, we don't have to think of the grid system the same way anymore with solar. Of course, it's revolutionary because we actually have access to electricity anywhere. So we can give access to communities that don't have access to electricities, indigenous communities, people living in poverty, in very easy ways now with solar plus battery. So I think that's really the root of what we're both doing Australia, Panama, and a bit everywhere in the world, especially in underdeveloped countries and communities, and that's a little bit more what we all need to be pushing for. Solar gives us the ability to give access to electricity anywhere, anytime, and we don't have to think about the grids the same way. We can just think about giving access to electricity to people that don't have it.
Yeah, and I think kind of to summarize that, we're talking about energy independence. And independence is something really important if you think about, as a consumer of energy, you don't want to have your electricity prices and your blackouts happening whenever and wherever, right? You want to have control of that. And so, Angelos, you work for DMV. At your company, you actually help with the risks and the mitigation and the logistics of these implementation of solar farms. Would you like to first of all touch on that? And then I'll ask you again another question about the consumer and its capacity building for independence.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Name's Angelo. I'm a senior consultant with DNV, and I also lead the Commonwealth Sustainable Energy Transition Youth. On DNV, it's a risk advisory firm, so we help investors, funders, private and public sector to get basically projects from inception all the way down to completion. So we get involved all across the value chain generally. One thing, if I may, before I go into the specifics of the work, just to tidy up what was said before me, we cannot be talking about an energy transition if we're not talking about the energy trilemma. You've all touched on the 3 bits, but just to summarize, we're talking about affordability, sustainability, and security or independence, like you put it, James, right? So trying to balance these 3 things is very hard and dependent on context. We are at the SDG pavilion, so maybe I can refer to SDG 7, which is affordable and clean energy for all, which also includes things like energy access. There's about 600 million people, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, still without access to electricity. Your projects are a testament to that. We're talking about energy efficiency, reducing the losses of energy use in our systems. We're also talking about clean cooking, which is perhaps something that is not discussed as often, especially when we're talking about corporate events, but is a very big part of that energy trilemma,
Well, do you want to talk about it? I'm guessing you're meaning it in the African context, right?
Generally, but clean cooking is a big challenge, especially for rural communities, because it has the obvious healthcare risks. There are families and communities that are still burning firewood inside their homes, and this is generally done by women with young children. So the implications on the health of these humans is significant. There are technologies that can overcome this. Electric stoves, sun-powered appliances as well. You talked about appliances earlier, James, too. So all of these components are part of SDG 7 when we talk about an affordable and clean energy for all. One other thing that I want to touch on, if I may, is the first part of our panel title, which is the just and inclusive. At the moment, last year actually, let me go down that path. China deployed more solar than the rest of the world collectively in history. There is a similar conversation when it comes to the global north, but we don't see equivalent numbers happening in the global south. Another stat that I can share is that all of Africa has less solar capacity than the state of Florida in the States. All of Africa, one state in the United States of America. So there is a lot of work to be done for that transition to actually become just and inclusive. What does that mean? A just share of opportunities, of technology, knowledge sharing, capacity building, maybe we can talk about that later, but also inclusive, bringing people along, talking about the small island developing states, talking about LDCs and how they can transition their energy systems to sustainable, safe, and affordable energy systems as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that sort of knowledge that you bring is really important to share. And I think capacity building, as you touched on earlier, if these communities were able to have the capacity building and the advocacy powers to go to their local government or their federal government and ask for this energy independence, I think that would be really helpful to be able to mobilize in their communities. So what would you say about the power and usefulness of capacity building, and especially the work that you've been doing with the Commonwealth Group?
Sure. I think capacity building is a key component in this equation because we are asking most of the global south to leapfrog when it comes to technologies. So we are asking most of the developing nations to jump over an industrial revolution that the Northwest typically had and go straight to implementing clean technologies. So capacity building is key. One of the projects that we undertook as CSET Youth was in Tanzania. The Commonwealth Secretariat has produced books around energy literacy. So these are primary school level of comic books where they explain to young children what is energy efficiency, why do we care about sustainability and things like this. And we actually managed to get our national chapter to take these books out to schools in rural areas of Tanzania and spend a day with children talking about clean energy, which typically is not part of the curriculum in rural areas all around the world. So capacity building is key, and get people to that awareness level that they need to get engaged, because for me that's the second step. We talk about capacity building and awareness, but ultimately the result that we want is young people to engage in these conversations at a high level, but also at the grassroots when it comes to local decision making, governance, communities down, in the ground as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I would like to actually ask our panelists what they think about the leapfrogging of some of these early nations. I know it's a very controversial topic, but especially from all of us actually not only being at a grassroots level of helping communities, but also all of us do have a top-down view with the companies that we work for and run that are doing large scale as well. So I would like to hear if any of you would like to share about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, leapfrogging is so important. I mean, we have access to new technologies that can actually deliver electricity to anyone, anywhere. It's just about implementing them. And again, we're asking these underdeveloped countries, underdeveloped communities to get access to electricity in different ways than we have in the past. So developed nations need to do their part, and in my view, it needs to be supported with a carbon tax. Here at the UN, we are at the SDG pavilion. It goes hand in hand. We need a carbon tax to create accountability for the biggest emitters, and also in order for those emitters to finance the development of underdeveloped nations who are asking to not get access to electricity through fossil fuels. We can't be access them talking to communities that don't have access to electricity and asking them to do it in a certain way without one, practicing what we preach in developed nations, and two, actually setting up a framework that supports that and incentivizes that for these local communities.
Okay, so Kevin, but just quickly, in that scenario, if there was a carbon tax on large companies and countries in Africa, what would happen then?
If there was a carbon tax on large companies in Africa, that's not how I think we should implement it. I think it should be a United Nations carbon tax, because if you implement it by country, the biggest challenge is that another country is just not going to implement it and become more attractive for fossil fuel players. So it needs to be, and it needs to be imposed. Today, we can't wait for the US to just choose to, change directions. And we don't really know, they're the second biggest emitters, of course, and we don't really know which countries might change their mind one day or another, and we're not really in control of that. But what the United Nations can control is a framework in which countries are held accountable for their carbon emissions, and support the development of nations that don't have access to electricity. And that's how I would suggest implementing it, not through taxing specifically African nations. On the opposite, they're the least developed nations on our planet. They need the support. They need to have subsidies from those carbon tax, financed from these carbon markets, and tax to subsidies and donations to develop electricity to communities that don't have access to them.
Yeah, well, let's hope. I went to an Article 6 session today in the Mediterranean Pavilion, discussing which countries in Europe were, pushing forward with that. So let's hope our Article 6 brothers and sisters are doing well. But yeah, Fahad, what are your thoughts on it?
I wanted to touch on the capacity building point that you had. Look, we've done projects in remote Australia, but also in the Pacific, in Bangladesh, Africa, and so on. Time and time again, what we see is, let's say, a PV system has been set, hybrid with batteries, generators, and so on.
Would you like to explain what you mean by a PV system to the audience?
PV is pretty much photovoltaic, so that's solar, the solar modules, right? So solar, battery, generator, whatever, like it's hybrid. So what we see again and again is, let's say, some companies, development partners, and so on, they have set up the system, they have their reports, they have the photos done, and then within 2 to 3 years, the system stops working. So, but in our financial calculations, in our modeling and so on, we expect at least 10 to 20 years, right? Why we see this is because there is lack of basic maintenance in those systems. So what happens is, let's say there is soiling, so there is dust on the panels, right? And then from there, the solar does not produce as much, and then because of that, the battery over discharges, and from there, so the PV stops working, the battery stops working, and then the whole system just fails. So what we try to do is we try to empower the communities with this capacity building. So there is obviously a high technical capacity building. We do it with installers, engineers, and so on. But something that I highly advocate for is capacity building in those communities as well, in developing countries. But again, we see this in Australia too. So we have to empower the locals in terms of, we start with basic things. Just clean your solar panels once every 2-3 months, depends on the rain on that area. And then have a look at the screen, how much the solar is doing. And maybe even, like, personally, I did a personal project in Bangladesh. I would get one, 12-year boy to take photo of the inverter just so that I can see if the inverter is, producing properly. So it's just these little things, but these are so avoidable. But again, be it Africa, Pacific, Australia, we keep seeing the same issues again and again, and it's just something we need to address with this capacity building that we're trying. It's a long process, but yeah, it's just something we're trying.
Can you give it to Angela?
If I may comment on this, there's 3 points here at different levels of hierarchy when it comes to capacity building. The first one is the capacity building at the grassroots level. So making sure that the community, is engaged with the development of the project, the commissioning of it, and then trained to actually operate and maintain it. I think is key. It goes without saying. It's one of the biggest added benefits of renewables compared to fossil fuels, for example, that you can actually engage the local community in that. The second is the capacity building that is lacking and causes problems like that. That means capacity building around contractual setups and arrangements. How do you actually treat manufacturers that are not domestic in your country? And what do you expect from the systems that you order? Warranties, guarantees, liquidated damages, all the contractual mechanisms you can have in place to make sure that a solar farm with a lifespan of 20 years doesn't break down in 3. That has to happen in the private sector space, but also the public money is a big contributor to these projects, especially when we're talking about nationally critical infrastructure. And this is the third level of capacity building that we need. Most small markets, emerging markets, call them whatever you want, could easily be fully net zero or running on renewables, provided the capital was there. However, if you were to bring in to a small island hundreds of millions of foreign money, without the appropriate, contractual and commercial fail-safes, let's say, you are basically selling out national critical infrastructure. What does that mean? A small island builds batteries, solar, substations, grid, and so on. A private company from abroad runs it as long as the profit makes sense. When the profits run dry, you turn off the tap or, just move out. And that is a massive risk for governments and a major broker for the deployment of capital in these markets. So how do we overcome this? I've run into 2 possible solutions. The first one is capacity building and strong government presence in those markets. We want the capital to be deployed. Yes, we need the infrastructure 100%, but there needs to be a stake from the government in those projects, both in terms of how they run, both who runs it, and potentially an equity stake as well. The same setup could also happen in the community where the project is taking place. We see things like energy communities, peer-to-peer trading, pay-as-you-go tariffs setup, which remove the capex constraint for most of these projects as well. So what happens? A private business comes in, they take up the burden of the initial investment, but they don't necessarily charge this directly, at that same time back to the community. They provide the service, they provide the electricity, and the community pay as they use essentially that system. All of these mechanisms and these three levels of capacity building are crucial if we are to actually get to the scale and the pace of implementation that we're shouting for at this COP.
Yeah, and I think what you just touched on is super important, and that is sovereign guarantees on capital in developing nations, because I think as Kevin was saying, as Kevin initially said about the announcement of the electrification system in Panama, I think that is a good example of like what we may call in Australia like a pilot. Once something like that is very successful, hopefully then the government would say, wow, we need to be doing that more, and get in touch with international investors to come in. However, why hasn't that already happened? As Angela said, private investors aren't going to come in unless they can get a return. And unfortunately, and as much as we can go on about how important the just transition is, they have a number. And that number for developing countries is about 15%. Because why would you invest in an investment with a high risk if your return's not going to be high? And normally that's around, let's say, 12 to 15%. What is a normal commercially viable solar farm, even in a city, probably going to be worth? It's probably sitting at like maybe 5, 6, 7%. Okay, that's why that gap, private investment, is not coming into developing nations, even though we have just discussed the reasons why it should. The only way to fix that, as Angela said, is with sovereign guarantees, working with the government to say, we can pay you a less amount, but we can guarantee it because we are the government. And hopefully, that trust and that confidence can be there to then get the money to the communities. As the panel have said, it's not just about getting the money to the communities. There needs to be the construction contracts in place so that we actually have locally led developers and critical infrastructure developers from these countries that are going to have the capacity to keep it going, as the panelists have said. So I think, we've now just gone like very top down what we need to do, but maybe we can get back to the grassroots level. Kevin, I'd love to hear more about your plan now that you have announced and invested in the community in Panama. What do you hope now for the future once this electrification system is in place?
Sure. I mean, we hope to do more of that. I mean, you pointed out a very good point. There's impact investing and there's philanthropy, and I think both of those have to happen, right? It's not one or the other. It's impact and philanthropy, and especially when you're going to underdeveloped communities, you can't just be talking about returns. You're talking to people that don't have access to electricity. That's the reality of it. You just want to be giving them electricity at the grassroots level, and then also building on that, seeing the solar capacity and seeing as some of those nations are getting richer and richer, those underdeveloped nations, you can also build trust and start to build more impact investment projects. So hopefully it's just one step out of many, and that's how I'd advise anyone to think about investment in underdeveloped countries. I'd start to think about donating first, and then also doing some impact work. I do want to touch a point that Angelo brought up also. It's about the difference about how we're doing actually the transition in different countries around the world. And I can talk a little bit also about the UAE, Dubai, where I live and set up our electric car startup. There's 3 types of solar projects, right? Residential, utility scale, which are the bigger ones, and commercial in between, right? So I just want to say, it's not going to be the same in every country. In less developed countries, where people don't have access to electricity, they're leapfrogging technologies, right? There is access directly to solar panels that give access to communities. in more developed countries, they're really rethinking the grid, right? How are we going to give access to electricity with these, transmission and distribution line? Does it really make sense for us to do it like in Australia, where there's a lot of, and actually, 10% of the electricity in Dubai is from renewable energy, but it's not solar rooftop, right? It's the biggest solar plant in the world, and they have the cheapest access to electricity. So there is, of course, a lot of bad press from some of those nations in the Middle East because are they, they're coming from fossil fuel economies, but they're definitely investing a lot in renewable energy. They're the lead investors worldwide in renewable energy. That's a simple fact. And with 50 gigawatts deployed from the UAE and worldwide, not just in the UAE, and they do have the biggest solar plants in the world, but they're doing it in a different way, which is utility scale. And they just announced, of course, a massive 1 gigawatt continuous projects in the UAE, solar plus storage. That means you need 5 gigawatts of solar, 20 gigawatts of battery storage. That's huge in terms of scale. That powers at least 800,000 households. I'm not sure exactly how much, but the scale at which you can do things on utility scale projects is also different. I talk a little bit about those because it's grassroots in a different way, I would say. Grassroots in the UAE way, yeah.
What I really like is that you not only are very passionate about, siding at a grassroots level in these communities that just need solar and you want to donate, but also you are thinking and you're doing the large scale as well. And I think that's hopefully all of you in the audience can take away is that if you're very passionate about helping a local community with solar, that is 100% like what you should be doing. But also it's good to educate yourself on what's going on in the grid scale in your country or maybe in other countries, because it is a connection, right? From retail to distribution to to transmission and commercial projects. It is really important to know. As you said, Dubai has the biggest solar farm. Did you know Australia has the biggest battery? We already have a 1 gigawatt battery, the Waratah super battery. And so, yeah,
that's awesome. I hope we all keep on beating those records, and I do hope you guys get COP next year. I mean,
has anyone checked WhatsApp? Like seriously, I think it's about to be announced. But anyway, we will continue. I think one thing we haven't touched on for a while is the inclusiveness side of this. So, yes, we do need large-scale solar and regional solar, but let's go back to the community aspect of this. Fahad, what have you seen? You are working in one of the remotest cities in the world. Yeah. What have you seen when you work with these, especially indigenous communities, and you consult them about solar in their off-grid systems? What are they saying and what do they need?
A lot of these communities, they already have electricity, so it basically runs on diesel, right? So they have some sort of idea about, the electrical factors, and they have loads in their house and so on. When we try to implement solar, people are a bit hesitant to change. They're because the thing is, diesel is proven. You just put a genset in, and then it's pretty much, it's pretty much guaranteed to work, right? But with solar, and the bad press doesn't help, the misinformation and all that. So people have had like different opinions. But yeah, overall, in terms of we try to give guarantees, we try to do community grassroots level training and so on, so that they know what is being installed, they can take care of it, and there is ownership. Right, there is some sort of ownership in the new system that was just installed. And it's not just it's solar, it's battery, and of course we add like a backup genset as well, because sometimes we have to say send in technicians for maintenance. Let's say once a year. That's in our modeling. That's what we use. We say 1 or 2 days a year. There will be the PV system will be off, so we'll need excess diesel on site as well as a generator for that. So we are not saying it's going to be 100%, fully clean. we have to be pragmatic as well. The thing is, what we see is if you go 95% renewable energy fraction to 99 or 100%, the total cost, capital cost of your system is going to increase 2, 3, 4, or even more fold, right? So this is why we're not saying we're going to go 100% clean. We have to be practical as well. We have to keep the, the capital cost in mind too, right? And so yeah, in that context, keeping in mind like the installed system and so on. And the other point I wanted to focus on, a lot of a lot of projects they have like the inclusivity factor as well. They will ask you and urge you to in the training teams, for example, and so on, have like diversity and inclusion, gender, youth, Aboriginal communities, and so on. So yeah, I mean that's what we try to implement and plan for the project as well. Not just the installation aspect, but the lifetime of it.
Can you delve deeper into that DEI? What do you mean in the training tips? What else is in there?
So I'll just give an example of a grant program called the Renew Pacific grant program that we've applied for. This is in Vanuatu. It's still in talks, so I can't like disclose much. But it's something that we've given the first application, and then we got back some feedback that we will need more input on JETC. So gender and people with disabilities, and we've included youth as well. So in our plan itself, we had to say that okay, we are going to do capacity building sessions for women, for youth, for people with disabilities. And it's not just mentioning, we have to we know people on site, so we had to consult them, we had to ask them for feasible numbers in terms of the women that's feasible to train, or people with disabilities that are over there. And the project is for actually schools, so it was easy to have like a good number of like youth. So this is just one example where the grant itself is telling us to have DEI, to include all these. And that it's great in the sense that it makes us think about them further as well, to plan ahead. And because I'm an engineer, I'm not a JETC expert, right? So, but it makes us think, and and then we look into the other thing we did was we also looked for JETC experts as well, those who have worked on it before, and they helped us plan this more, right? So it's a process, and and my main point is it's great that these are part of the in terms of the points you get for your application. It's great that these are included, and it makes us think and implement them in our planning, and hopefully when the project actually gets implemented, we'll have to include them as well.
Thanks, Hod. I'd love to hear from the other two panelists about how they have found, from a philanthropy level or also just like a private investment level, about those points of the just transition and an equitable implementation of these solar farms. So maybe you, Angelo, first. Have you seen in your company, when you're looking at risk, when you're looking at mitigation and logistics of the implementation of this, is those points of community benefit sharing delve deeper than just they need to be benefited?
I operate in the UK market, so we can argue that there's enough generation, distribution and transmission in the UK energy system already to have gone past that point. Because, for example, energy access in the UK is pretty much 100%. So the benefit comes more on the affordability side of the equation. So one of the big push of the UK government now is to try and reduce electricity bills and how much taxpayers pay. I think fundamentally renewables bring that to the equation, right? The main reason why the UK bills are still so high is the price of fossil fuels. It's not the opposite. You talked about misinformation and disinformation, right? That's just how it is. Now, in other places, I think inclusivity is still a bit challenging when it comes to new developments of projects. Especially when it comes to rural communities, we have to be talking about the basic infrastructure as well. So we are looking at mini grids combined with solar, some storage to try and give that community access. And then you can start working up from there. I guess on the big picture vision, for me, ultimately, in any place in the future, that's going to be the setup. So a neighborhood could operate as an island, so they would theoretically be able to operate self-sustainably, but it would all be interconnected and form the national grid as well. So you would start from mini grids all over the place, all of them interconnected, then connected to the national system, everybody's connected. And that enables a lot trading, balancing electricity, both technically and commercially, so the prices and so on. So I think my vision is that we want to go somewhere like that. The second piece of this equation is security. We talked about this before. Some of you might be aware, but the Iberian Peninsula, so Portugal and Spain, had a massive blackout a few months ago. And there was a lot of press that came out. It's like, this is what happens when you put so much renewable in your system. You need to continue burning fossil fuels because you have the safety and security and so on and so forth. In reality, both the network operated quite well during that blackout, so they were able to delay the inevitable. I'm not going to go into the technical discussion now. For long, the interconnectors with other countries came in to support massively, but what was missing was storage. That's what I specialize on. We didn't have enough, not just batteries, because when we talk storage, typically we talk about lithium-ion batteries, but pumped hydro, a diversity of technologies to kind of resolve that situation. So that's a big part of inclusivity, really, because we are talking about affordability in the case of the UK, we are talking about security in the case of rural communities, but even in European countries like Spain and Portugal, where you have these well-developed energy systems, we are still struggling to get the security component right. One last thing to say, for places like small islands, there is still an argument that fossil fuels are more secure than new energy renewables. But in reality, if the ship carrying the gas or the diesel or the kerosene doesn't show up, you don't have energy. That's not a thing with solar. I've seen more times ship being late and the island running out of power than the sun not coming up in the morning. So, yeah.
I'll just say what I think just an inclusive transition, energy transition means to me at least. It means that every country in the world has a framework and is supported in their energy transition. Just and inclusive really means about, and we're at the United Nations, supporting those underdeveloped countries get out of poverty, have access to energy, and that's the context of just an inclusive energy transition. And so I really do think, I can't say it enough, I hope this COP is going to have an outcome with a carbon tax, and I hope it gets imposed. I would like to hear something like, we're the United Nations and we are setting a new rules. Climate action is undeniable and it's happening, and we do need every country to pay their fair share of damages that they're doing, and we're going to use this to subsidize countries that are going out of that are getting out of poverty and that don't have access to electricity, and we are telling to not use fossil fuels, which we can't be telling them how to get out of poverty. So this is what I think would make just an inclusive energy transition, a framework. And again, the US is not here. They're the second biggest emitter of carbon emissions. They need to be taxed. Instead of talking a little bit about their import taxes, a little bit of, I don't really know. They're the ones that really need to be taxed in the setting and the context of climate action. We can't rely on the decision making. This needs to be imposed to them. This needs to be used to subsidize countries that are not in that are not developed. And yeah, that's how I see just an inclusive energy transition, and that can be true for a lot of countries. We've had this in Brazil in the past. Bolsonaro wanted to destroy the Amazon rainforest. We can't rely the United Nations can't rely on the whim of one country, of our new leader that's trying to say something that's opposite. It needs to step up and have some new rules that support climate action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'd just like to ask the audience, did any of you know that Australia had a carbon tax over 10 years ago? In 2012, the Australian government, which was a progressive government at the time, imposed a carbon tax. What happened? Within 1 year, there was an extreme amount of benefits and money coming into the government that they were able to use to subsidize our now blossoming solar industry. That sounds great, right? It wasn't. That progressive government was voted out so swiftly because Australia is a petrostate funded by fossil fuel companies, and that government did not get in for another 10 years. So there was some extreme, and you touched on government, I totally agree. I mean, we're going off topic now, but national governments, especially the ebb and flows of the left versus the right, unfortunately, it does impact environmental policy.
I'm just going to say something. Portugal did the same, and then they backed out. The reason it won't work at a national level, fossil fuel companies will go somewhere else where there is no tax, because they're not being they don't have to do it in the place where there is a tax. It needs to be done at a United Nations level. This is a global catastrophe, right? It's not a local catastrophe, and it needs global action. And in order to do that, there needs to be a new system in order to actually incentivize the right actions. Because if we're not incentivized to do the right thing, it doesn't matter how much each of us want it, there's always going to be some naysayer or someone else that's going to try to do it with a different way that saves them more money, or that, if we're not incentivized to do the right way. And we need to be incentivized. And I'm hoping this is going to be an outcome here. And I'm hoping maybe also we're going to get the cup in Australia and continue these discussions there.
Yeah, and I would like to go back to what Angelos was talking about, because you actually touched on two extremely important points for this discussion, and going back to a more community level with this. So you talked about an energy island, Angelo. I don't know if you made that up or if that's a term in the UK, but whereby, imagine if you had solar farms on your roofs, your whole street had a community battery, and you had electric cars that could then power your house and your electric appliances. That actually exists in Australia, and we call it the virtual power plant, the VPP. And as a matter of fact, in the Northern Territory, where Fahad and I are currently doing work, we are trying to implement it there in the most regional communities. And the second point that you brought up was about the importance of storage. And I couldn't agree more. In Australia, we have so much rooftop solar, and this is such an incredible fact that maybe you all don't know. We have free energy in Australia. For between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. every day, our energy prices are zero. They're for free. You can turn your light on in your house and you don't need to pay anything. And that is actually bad. Why is it bad? Because everyone in Australia has installed solar panels on their house, and now they don't get any money from it because the operators are saying it's now, we're not getting anything from it, so we're not going to give you any money for it. What would happen if all of us with solar had a battery? We could charge the battery when those prices were for free and actually use it in the peak times. That would allow the price curve to absolutely drop on average, instead of what it currently is in Australia, which is a duck curve, which the price is high in the peak hour. It goes to literally $0, sometimes actually negative, because as you all know, coal plants can't just turn on and off like solar. Coal plants have to stay on, and it takes them maybe 8 hours at a time to stop. So the coal plants have to keep going. So when prices are zero, the coal just keeps going, and so they actually charge at a negative price in Australia. It's an absolutely incredible phenomenon that's going on. And yes, I hope next year we can have this global spotlight on us and teach you all more about it. But yeah, thank you for bringing up those points. Yeah.
Can I just say a couple of things there? A couple of days ago, South Korea joined the Powering Past Coal Coalition. South Korea is the fourth biggest importer of coal globally, but because of market pressures, they decided to join the international coalition that we are phasing out coal completely. This is a massive win globally. Australia is somewhere on that list too. You are burning quite a bit of coal. What you described is correct, 100% on the energy system. If you had enough storage on your electricity network, you could shift the right amount of load from midday where your solar is peak to later in the day, and in theory, not need coal plants at all on your system.
It's
Just
not in theory. This is in practice.
It
This is
happens.
happening right now. Yeah.
Correct. Just one other benefit of storage, and this is what I was going to say. The reason why we get blackouts is because frequency tends to get out of control and things, need to go offline. Imagine if you were to turn on all of the devices in your house, at some point your central board would be like, I can't keep up with this, and it would drop the relay. It's similar with the general electricity system and the electricity system. With enough storage, you can try and help and regulate voltage and frequency in a way where you wouldn't get blackouts. So I think storage for me is the big piece. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a big piece in the puzzle when it comes to the energy transition.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And we only have 4 minutes left of this panel discussion today, so I'm going to give each of you 1 minute to describe what you think a call to action would be to help with grassroots mobilization for a just and inclusive energy transition. Firstly, with you, Fahad.
I will reiterate the point about capacity building. We are seeing projects, we are seeing funding from the World Bank and so on in communities, in developing communities, developing countries and so on. But again, as mentioned, I keep seeing all over the world similar issues of, the PV plant, the solar plant, it just stops working, and that gives solar a bad name. And the people in the community are like, oh, before we had diesel, it was fine. Now your solar is not working, right? So again, and then this is where, the other folks, the misinformation crew, they jump in, and there's a lot of effects. So for me, a very good way of fixing this would be, again, we're repeating ourselves, but the capacity building and just making sure the systems in place are working. And the other thing is also like online monitoring. So like, again, 10, 15 years ago, monitoring was not as prevalent, especially in remote communities. Nowadays, we have Starlink as well. So making sure we have the monitoring, and then also we have specific people, perhaps in those local communities, and we train making sure we are just and inclusive. So they can take care of their own systems in a way. They can be like, oh, the sun is really bright today, but my system, instead of doing 10 kilowatt, it's doing 5 kilowatt. So something must be not right. So then they can have a look. They can perhaps see if it's cleaning or something else. And what will be better is if we can have a technician, a certified technician in those areas, and then they can immediately just have a look and fix it. But that's another topic in terms of, that's another thing. I feel like we need more technical people in our field, but that's just another.
We do need more technical. We need more technical people here.
Yeah,
at COP.
all over the world. Yeah, for sure.
Kevin.
I'd just say call to action, like you mentioned, carbon tax and renewable energy subsidy. Carbon tax for developed countries that are emitting the most, renewable energy subsidy. It's so important that we reset the rules and incentivize the right behaviors. I'll add to that, it really warms my heart. I met the indigenous community of Pamanama. Really, they don't have access. These are women that don't have access to electricity, that are safeguarding our nature. Again, this is the COP in Brazil. It's happening, and it's really the COP of the indigenous people of Latin America, more specifically. So, our company operates in Panama, so we decided to donate there because we can get employees engaged as well, and it's so important. So I do encourage each of you, if you do work in companies that do have a philanthropic arm to push for, and it sometimes gets overlooked, but just donating solar panels. We don't have to wait for our governments either. We can each push our companies to do more, to give access to electricity to communities that don't, especially those that are so connected to nature and helping safeguard our ecosystems.
Nice one. I agree. I don't know if we can do Q&A as well. Maybe they're not going to throw us out, but just putting it out there. I know we're on time, I'm just saying. One quick thought from me, James, I know you've heard me say this before, but obviously the conversation in my perspective has changed a little bit the last time, right? We've gone from arguing the science behind climate change to argue science at this point on a global level. So I think we need to remember two things. One, we need to stop bringing stats and facts to a feelings fight, because generally now it seems like we're having a feelings fight globally in the political conversation. And two is that the real work happens outside the 2 weeks of COP. You know, all of us here are quite privileged to be here. What matters is what happens next week and the week after and the other 50 weeks in the year that we're not having the high-level conversations. I will close just by saying a little bit, this is me taking my technical hats off. I don't speak on behalf of any of the organization, I'm just speaking as me now. There's a fundamental difference between renewables and the fossil fuel industry, and that's the shift that we're trying to make. We're trying to move away from an extractive system to an inclusive system. Fossil fuels take out, refine, resell, while renewables create and distribute domestically. That same shift in energy system is the same shift that we're trying to have in the way we organize society. So in those 50 weeks outside of COP, we need to get more people engaged to actually come along in this transition. Because I think that's what we've, in the last 2 or 3 years kind of forgotten a little bit. And that's why sometimes it might feel like we might be losing. But in reality, we're not. We have the same amount of investment in clean energy as we have in fossil fuels now. That was not the case. We're building, I think, 1 gigawatt of solar every 15 minutes at this point. So we are winning, but we need to remind people why this is happening and that it's for us,
Awesome. Yeah, I agree.
Can I just say, I couldn't agree more. Again, it's facts and figures. 99% of the scientific community agree on climate action is necessary, basically. In other words, we're more certain that we're destroying our planet than about how our planet actually came to exist, the Big Bang. So there is no questioning about this. It's about acting to safeguard those ecosystems, and these are the ecosystems that safeguard us. Again, the planet's been here billions of years before us. It's going to be here billions of years after us. So we're only here in passage, and we need to make sure we keep it a habitable planet for the different species here, and of course for humans.
I love that positive ending to the panel today. It looks like we do have some more time. So do we have a question from the audience that we can ask?
No, we're okay.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
I really enjoyed the extractive, moving into a more inclusive system point that was made. A little bit closer, that better? I really enjoyed I forget the specific wording, but moving from an extractive system to an inclusive system wording that you used before. And I know we're focusing on the energy transition, but I'd be curious to hear what other areas of the just transition you think that can be kind of transplanted into. I know you're all energy specialists, but obviously there's a lot of overlap with agriculture just over there, with the pavilions, other areas that you might have interest in. Quite open-ended, but there you go.
Sure. I started an electric car company, so electric cars, mobility is so important. I think there is both action and prevention and restoration. I think those are a little bit the two main themes. But there is so much we need to be doing. Coral reefs, hopefully we get the COP in Australia, but 84% of our coral reefs are bleached. That's crazy. There's so much we need to be doing. We need to be planting more coral reefs, and there's no way we're going to make up for 84% of our planet's coral reefs. It's already too late, unfortunately. There are other things. Of course, glacier melts we can't be preventing, but there is a lot more we can be doing in terms of fighting wildfires. We need to train more firefighters. We need, people instead of joining the army. I would suggest, instead of fighting each other, we should be fighting our fires. We're going to need a lot more of those. Reforestation. It's a big topic at this COP, of course. The Amazon rainforest needs to be protected, but there has been so much destruction and devastation across forests. I think something like 10 hectares of forests are destroyed every year, both by man-made activities, but also by wildfires. So there's so many interests and so much we could be doing. So yeah.
So a couple of things, right? I agree with everything. Agriculture, food system, water systems will be a major conversation in the next 10 years generally, how we get our water, how we clean our water, all of these things. Energy will continue being a big part of the conversation for two reasons. One, because it's 75% of our emissions generally. So we need to sort out energy. When I say energy, it's not just electricity. Heavy industry, aviation, maritime, all of that stuff, mobility you talked about. But the second, when it comes to inclusivity, I find very interesting around information. So in theory, if we were to extrapolate many years in the future, the cost of energy will eventually be the cost of information. So if we were to electrify everything, blah, 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 however much it would cost to transmit energy, it would cost to transmit information, which would be very low. So now we come to the conversation on AI, right? Because at the moment we have models that are trained by the very few, and there's a lot of people that are not included in that conversation. So we're teaching our information networks and systems based on a very small proportion of our knowledge as a human species. So I don't have a solution to that yet, but hopefully the energy transition will unlock that part too. Like we can get more people. We talk about indigenous knowledge, for instance, when it comes to forest preservation and so on. That information is kind of kept in a locked box in someone's head in a tribe in the forest kind of thing, Hopefully, with the energy transition, we can democratize all of humanity's information and knowledge, not just the global north.
Thanks for the question. I personally find myself really passionate about the energy industry and decarbonization and so on. So what I say is anything that uses electricity has the potential of, being solarized, right? So making it clean. I find myself really into projects, for example, in food, where agrovoltaics. I've done a little bit of little projects here and there in terms of concept notes and so on, in terms of integrating agrovoltaics, sorry, and then irrigation pumps. You know how before we would see, there would be diesel-powered irrigation pumps. Now we see DC or even AC, and then you just put a solar system and it's running and it's clean. And again, the funny thing is we see in the farmers in, for example, developing countries, they're like, why isn't this making any noise? Is this even running? Our diesel pumps, you could hear them, you could smell and so on, right? So, but the fact that we can make all of this clean, this is where I find myself just trying to see if there's anything else. Even EVs, for example, the fact that, the advent of EVs has been fantastic. And there's a lot more coming in terms of, I'll say export in grid integration, right? When they say you can use your batteries, you can use your EV to export to the grid. Right?
Vehicle to grid, yeah.
Vehicle to grid, V2G. V2G, yeah. So there's so many aspects and there's so many new things coming up as well. And I find myself really passionate about these aspects and, eventually seeing I didn't even touch on what. There's so many other things, to be honest. Behind us, we have the list of all the SDGs, and be it quality education, sustainable cities, there's electricity in everything, and we have the potential to solarize or make all of them clean. And this is something that really excites me. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks to our panelists. If I may, I would answer your question by saying indigenous knowledge. So with the mining industry, they just came in, they didn't give 2 cents about what the communities thought or what the farmers thought. They built the mines and they literally extracted. Now with the renewable energy transition, community benefits sharing, social license, using the knowledge of which trees to keep, which rivers to keep, where is the biomes necessary, where should the wind turbines be, using consultations from indigenous elders, and to have an inclusive transition. And I agree, your quote is definitely the quote of this session. I wrote it down. We are moving from an extractive system to an inclusive system. So I'd like to thank all the panelists. Could we get a round of applause today? And thank you all for coming. And have a good COP, and let's see what happens in the next 1 hour.
Thank you.